living in a time when unfairness rules. The strong take advantage of the helpless, and God seems silent. You pray, plead, and still nothing shifts. Evil grows stronger, and injustice spreads wide. Those trying to live rightly feel abandoned. But what if God saw everything? What if he had a plan, though it wasn't what people expected? This was the struggle faced by the prophet Habakkuk, a man troubled by his nation's disorder. Habakkuk lived in Judah during one of its darkest times. God's chosen people had abandoned his laws, and every level of society was corrupt. Violence wasn't rare, it was normal. The weak were crushed, and those in power were filled with greed and idolatry. People who lived righteously were mocked or attacked. The prophet watched in despair. Where was God during all this chaos? Why did he remain silent? Although the book doesn't specify when Habakkuk prophesied, many scholars believe it was between King Josiah's final years and the early reign of Jehoiakim. Josiah had led spiritual reforms to renew the nation's covenant with God. But his death ended that progress. His son Jehoiakim had no interest in justice, choosing oppression and idol worship instead. The temple became a political tool rather than a place of holy worship. Even the courts were broken, judges favored the rich and harmed the poor. Globally, the world was shifting fast. Assyria, once a dominant empire, was collapsing. Meanwhile, Babylon was rising, conquering lands with destruction and force. Judah, a small and fragile kingdom, was caught in the middle of this storm. The danger was real, yet the people ignored it. They lived like nothing bad could ever happen. It was during this period that Habakkuk raised his voice, not to lecture the people, but to question God directly. Different from other prophets, Habakkuk spoke to God, not the people. With a burdened heart and disturbed thoughts, he poured out his complaints, raising questions that still echo today. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Habakkuk was desperate for answers, but God's response would change his outlook completely. If you enjoy uplifting Bible stories, like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video. Habakkuk stood out among prophets. While most brought God's words to the people, he did the reverse. He took the people's pain to God. His soul was in turmoil. He saw evil thriving, justice dying, and innocent people suffering. The prophet couldn't accept this as normal. How could a holy and fair God allow such disorder? Why did he seem far away when the innocent were hurting? In his pain, Habakkuk asked bold and honest questions. He didn't hide his anger or confusion. His words weren't just complaints. They were a deep cry for justice. In the first chapter, he challenges God, saying, How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Habakkuk 1:2. These words are full of despair. Habakkuk wasn't just confused, he was heartbroken. His grief stemmed from knowing God's true nature. He believed God was kind, just, and powerful. But if that was so, why did evil go unpunished? Habakkuk didn't stop at one question. He pressed further, asking, Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The evil surround the righteous, causing justice to be twisted. Habakkuk 1:4. This verse shows how deeply troubled the prophet was. He didn't just notice the injustice, he lived through it daily, powerless to stop it. The law, meant to defend the vulnerable, had become useless. The justice system was corrupted, and the wicked always escaped punishment. His questions were bold, maybe even risky, but what made Habakkuk stand out was not that he questioned, but that he took those questions directly to God. Rather than let his anger drive him away from God, Habakkuk brought his frustrations to The Lord. He didn't complain to others, pretend all was well, or stay quiet. He chose the most difficult path, confronting his doubts in God's presence. But was he ready for the answer? What God was about to reveal would be unexpected and hard to accept. Habakkuk was hoping God would act fast to fix Judah's corruption. He might have expected a revival, a good king, or a punishment for the corrupt leaders. But God's response was nothing like he imagined. God wasn't ignoring the evil around him. In fact, he had already decided how to handle it, and his plan was astonishing. Look among the nations and watch. Be amazed. I am doing something in your days you wouldn't believe, even if told, says Habakkuk 1:5. God was preparing a tool of discipline for Judah, the Babylonian Empire. The Chaldeans, as they were called, were quickly becoming a fierce military power. They didn't just win battles, they destroyed with savage brutality. Their hunger for power couldn't be satisfied, and their pride was unmatched. God described them with alarming clarity. I am raising up the Babylonians, that harsh and reckless people who sweep through the earth to take lands that are not theirs. They are feared and dreaded. They live by their own rules and bring glory only to themselves. Habakkuk 1:6-7. This answer shocked Habakkuk. He wanted justice, but never expected God to use a nation more wicked than Judah to deliver it. The Babylonians were infamous for their cruelty. They attacked like a raging storm, leaving destruction behind. Their power was overwhelming, and they used it without mercy. God continued to describe them. Their horses are faster than leopards, and more savage than evening wolves. Their cavalry comes from afar, flying like an eagle ready to devour. Habakkuk 1:8. This wasn't just God permitting Babylon's rise. He was actively empowering them as a form of judgment. Judah's sin had reached a breaking point, and divine punishment couldn't be delayed. But how could this be accepted? How could God's justice align with using such a vicious people as Babylon to bring correction? God's answer stirred even more questions in Habakkuk. How could a righteous God let such evil thrive? How could he allow Babylon to succeed while other nations suffered? Habakkuk wasn't going to stop asking. If God was open to answering, he would keep questioning. He had to understand God's intentions and was ready for another conversation. With the Lord, Habakkuk was even more disturbed by God's reply. He desired justice for Judah, but was unsettled that God would use a more wicked nation for this purpose. He struggled to understand how a pure God could let Babylon flourish through destruction. With this confusion, Habakkuk approached God once. Again, he couldn't find peace without clarity. Lord, aren't you eternal? My God, my Holy One, we will not perish. You, Lord, have chosen them for judgment. You, my rock, have appointed them to correct us. Your eyes are too pure to look at evil. You can't tolerate wrong. So why do you allow traitors to prosper? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow those more righteous than they? Habakkuk 1:12-13. The prophet was troubled. He knew God was eternal, pure, and just. So how could he use a prideful and idol-worshipping people as his instrument? Babylon didn't just conquer, they worshipped their own power. To Habakkuk, this was a disturbing contradiction. God was letting a nation more corrupt than Judah triumph. His frustration is clear in his imagery. He paints a vivid picture to express his dismay. You have made people like fish in the sea, like sea creatures without a ruler. The wicked enemy pulls them up with hooks, catches them in nets and gathers them in dragnets. Then he celebrates and rejoices. Habakkuk 1:14-15. Habakkuk saw the nations as helpless fish and the Babylonians as merciless fishermen capturing them all. And what did the Babylonians do afterward? They celebrated their evil, praised themselves, and gave credit to their own strength as if it were a god. Habakkuk, still searching for understanding, asked God one last heartfelt question. Will he continue to empty his net and destroy nations without compassion? Habakkuk 1:17. Habakkuk wanted answers. If God is truly just, then Babylon must also be judged. The prophet Habakkuk understood that the Lord does not overlook sin, but he wanted to hear that assurance directly from God. In the midst of this inner struggle, Habakkuk made a firm decision to wait for God's response. He adopted the posture of a watchman. I will stand at my guard post and position myself on the tower. I will wait to see what the Lord will say and how he will answer my complaint. Habakkuk 2. This posture reveals something deeply significant. Even with his doubts, Habakkuk believed that God would respond. He did not run from his crisis of belief. He did not brush his questions aside. Rather, he brought them honestly before God, and once again, the Lord would not leave him in silence. But the divine reply would go far beyond a simple explanation. It would be a profound revelation. Habakkuk stayed on his watch, eager for God's response. He didn't just want answers, he desired a revelation that aligned with divine justice. And when God answered, it wasn't in a way the prophet may have expected. Write down the vision and make it plain on tablets so a messenger may run with it. For the vision awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it. It will surely come and will not be late. God's reply was not merely an explanation. It was a powerful unveiling of divine purpose. The Lord had a perfect timeline, and Babylon's judgment had already been determined. It would happen in due time. What was needed now was faith. Then came one of the Bible's most quoted truths. The righteous shall live by his faith. Habakkuk 2:4. This was the heart of God's answer. Habakkuk had to understand that divine justice never fails, even when it appears delayed. The wicked might seem to flourish temporarily, but their fate is sealed. The righteous, in contrast, live not by sight, but by steadfast faith in God. The Lord then unveiled the arrogance of Babylon. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. The Babylonians relied on their strength, but that pride would destroy them. They conquered nations and boasted about it, forgetting that they were under God's authority. Their seemingly unstoppable power was just a mirage. God declared that Babylon's cycle of destruction would come to an end. They would be judged, and their actions would not go unnoticed or unpunished. The Lord reigns over all, and every judgment comes at its appointed time. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Habakkuk 2:14. This was a promise. A guarantee that despite current turmoil, God's justice would ultimately triumph. The present. Chaos would not stop God's plan from unfolding. Habakkuk now stood at a crossroads. He could either keep questioning or fully put his trust in God. The answer was laid before him, and his faith journey was about to go deeper. God's message left no room for doubt. Babylon would be judged. Not only did the Lord promise justice, but he clearly listed their wrongs and declared judgment. This came through 5 woes, each a pronouncement of doom against the Chaldeans, for their pride, cruelty, and idol worship. The first woe condemned their greed. Woe to him who amasses stolen goods and becomes rich through extortion. How long can this continue? Habakkuk 2-6. They plundered cities and grew wealthy by ruthless means. Yet God warned, those who build riches through injustice will eventually be victims of their own evil. The second woe targeted their hunger for power. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting it high to avoid disaster. The Chaldeans sought safety in conquest, but trusting in human power was useless. No fortress or wealth could shield them from God's judgment. The third woe highlighted their violent empire. Woe to him who builds a city with blood and founds it on crime. Habakkuk 2:12. Their power was built on death and destruction, but their brief glory would end in shame. The fourth woe revealed their cruel humiliation of others. Woe to him who gives his neighbors drink, mixing it to expose their nakedness. Habakkuk 2:15. Drunkenness in this passage represents how Babylon humiliated and conquered other nations, leaving them in disgrace. However, God promises that they too will face the consequences of their actions. The cup of his anger will be poured out on them. The fifth and final judgment speaks against idol worship. The verse mocks those who speak to wood or stone statues, expecting them to come alive and offer guidance, even though they are lifeless objects, merely decorated with gold and silver. These idols have no breath or power. The Babylonians placed their trust in man-made images, but God, the living creator, is the one who truly rules over everything. Unlike their dead idols, God is alive and supreme. Though Babylon appeared invincible, its downfall was already determined. God would demonstrate that no empire, no matter how mighty, could stand against his judgment. This realization changed Habakkuk. Once full of questions, he began to see God's greatness and slowly started placing his full trust in him. After hearing God's response and realizing that both Judah and Babylon would be judged, Habakkuk underwent a personal transformation. Previously anxious and questioning, he turned to prayer instead. Chapter 3 contains one of the most moving prayers in the Bible. This time, Habakkuk wasn't asking for answers, but acknowledging God's majesty. He begins his prayer by saying, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day. Make them known in our time. In your wrath, remember mercy." Habakkuk 3:2. In these words, the prophet shows deep respect and fear. He knows God has acted powerfully in the past and believes he will act again. He doesn't ask for judgment to be removed, but prays for mercy to come alongside it. In the verses that follow, Habakkuk vividly describes God's power. He recalls God's past actions, such as delivering Israel, and emphasizes his control over nature and nations. He speaks of God's radiant glory filling the heavens and power shining like sunlight from his hand. God is portrayed as a mighty warrior bringing justice. Natural disasters like earthquakes and plagues reflect his unstoppable might. Habakkuk goes on to recall specific moments when God saved his people, parting the Red Sea and defeating their enemies. Each memory is a tribute to God's control over history. Yet beyond power and judgment, Habakkuk shows human vulnerability. He says, "I heard and my heart pounded, my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us." Habakkuk 3:16. Now he is willing to wait, no longer demanding instant answers. He understands he doesn't need to know every detail of God's plan. He just needs to trust. His spiritual journey nears completion. Instead of focusing on what he sees around him, he focuses on who God is. His prayer becomes a powerful vision of divine glory. Habakkuk now sees God not just as a judge, but as the eternal ruler over all of history. God's presence fills heaven and earth. He is not distant, but active and majestic. Habakkuk continues describing God's impact on creation. Mountains shake, rivers roar, and even the stars respond to his voice. He writes, "In fury you strode across the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations." Habakkuk 3:12. This shows God's authority over all kingdoms. No empire can oppose him. Israel's history is full of examples of God's power, freeing them from Egypt, parting seas, winning battles, and providing in the wilderness. The same God is still at work today and will rule the future. This vision deeply changes Habakkuk. Once overwhelmed with questions, he now finds peace. He doesn't need to grasp every part of God's plan. He only needs to trust. God's glory reveals not only his strength, but also his purpose. Habakkuk now sees God as one who judges, but also one who saves and protects. His final conclusion is clear. Faith is the only right response to such greatness. His transformation is complete. He no longer seeks explanations, only trust. At the beginning, Habakkuk cried out in frustration about injustice and waited for God to act. "How long, Lord, must I call for help?" Habakkuk 1-2. But now he doesn't cry for answers or demand justice. Instead, he rests in total faith. His attention has shifted from troubling events to the God who remains sovereign through it all. This transformation is powerfully shown when he declares, "Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will be joyful in God my Savior." Habakkuk 3:17-18. Even in a time of complete lack, he chooses to rejoice in God. His focus is no longer on what is missing, but on the God above it all. The prophet who once questioned whether God was paying attention now finishes his journey with unshakable faith. He understands that God's justice will come at the right time and that true security is found in God, not in circumstances. Habakkuk closes his prayer with a powerful image of strength and freedom. "The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." Habakkuk 3:19. Like a deer confidently climbing steep mountains, Habakkuk now walks in faith without fear of falling, because God is holding him up. His journey of doubt has turned into a life of faith. He who once cried out in confusion now lives with deep trust. Habakkuk's story shows that we may not always receive explanations from God, but we can have something even greater, assurance of his sovereignty and trustworthiness. From a place of distress and questioning, Habakkuk moved to a place of faith and worship. Chapter 3 transforms from a desperate prayer to a song of unwavering trust in God's power and goodness, no matter the situation. If you like Bible stories like this one about the prophet Habakkuk, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos. Like the video and share it with a friend.